This is Find Your Flow, a show about navigating the complexities of life and business through the lens of curiosity. I'm your host, Angelique, and I bring together experts to deliver responsibly curated conversations and perspectives that aim to progress people and the planet. Welcome back. Today we are exploring the nexus between a resilient mindset and peak performance from a mental health therapist, mindfulness and performance coach, Emily Perrin. Emily, so good to have you. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh my goodness. Thanks for having me. What an introduction. I love it.
Well, I was going to say that does not even give it, half the all of your accomplishments. So I'd love to give you some time to just share a bit about yourself and your background and what brought you to focusing on mental health and performance specifically.
Yeah. Okay. So background, I always say it's really important for people to understand that I am the daughter of a coach, a very good coach. My dad was a college basketball coach for the first 10 years of my life. And has a PhD in sports psychology. So, I think from a very young age, I was exposed to performance and mindset and resiliency and what we think of as like the psychological element of sport and performance. And so that was my world, right? Growing up. But I was also a pretty elite athlete. I was a swimmer and then a soccer player. I played Division I soccer at the University of Virginia. And then I got right into coaching. I coached collegiately at the University of Pennsylvania for several years before realizing that, really how I wanted to work with people was not coaching in the sports sense, right? And I always say I love soccer, I love sports, but I didn't really want to be doing a lot of the X's and O's. And I certainly didn't want to be recruiting, which was a lot of college coaching. I wanted to be working with athletes. I knew that. At the time, I didn't know how I wanted to be working with athletes. And so much of my job as a young college coach, especially in the Ivy League, was really developing relationships and getting to know my players as people. And I loved that. I absolutely loved that. And so I left college coaching and, I'm pretty open and honest about my own journey, significant journey with mental health. Always from a very young age had pretty chronic anxiety and panic attacks, experienced quite a bit of trauma throughout my childhood and into early adulthood. And things really just kind of came to a head when I left coaching at Penn. And I think part of that was tied into my identity. Who am I without sport and coaching? And I really I hit rock bottom and I had to kind of figure out a way to live my life and live a life that was worth living. And I really dove into obviously therapy and getting the mental health treatment that I needed, but I also dove into a yoga practice. And that very quickly led me down the path of mindfulness and meditation and breath work and the nervous system and all of the above. And I found very quickly through my own practice, in addition to a lot of the mental health treatment that I was seeking, that added piece of mindfulness was just really transformational for me and my mental health. And that's where I kind of put two and two together and was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do for a living. This is how I want to work with people. I didn't have it all figured out in that moment, but I knew that's what I wanted to do and to give back. And specifically working with athletes, obviously here I am 5 years later with my business that really does mindfulness training and helps athletes incorporate this into their lives. But that's my story. That's my journey. And I think, something that, many people can say, right, is that their personal lives very much contributed to their professional world. But I think very genuinely and authentically, I live, what I do for a living every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that it just rings loud and clear as you were talking about your story. I mean, it was from childhood till now. I mean, it's formidable. It's every part of your experience. And one of the things that stood out for me is when you had first been introduced to yoga and the mindfulness aspect, So I'm curious, why do you think mindfulness and perhaps even that yoga mindset, why has that not been part of sports and performance coaching for so long until now?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's really, really just in the last decade, right?
Right.
And part of that is, oh, I can't even remember over COVID, right? When they released The Last Dance, the Netflix documentary with Michael Jordan in it. And, we've seen really since then, but maybe even a little bit before, a couple of professional athletes or coaches kind of talking about their journey with maybe mindfulness or meditation or yoga. I think it has been around in pockets. Um, and but to your point, right? This is a 2,500-year-old concept that has, really been quite transformational in many, um, not only, Buddhist and Hindu philosophy and theory, but if you think
Mhm.
about it, many of our modern day psychological interventions that we are using to treat mental health, mental illness,
Mhm.
there is a mindfulness component to almost all of them,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so yeah, I don't really know why. And to be fair, now that I've started moving in this space, a lot of people, I was actually just reading a book earlier today that was talking all about awareness, right? And this sense of, awareness, being able to really like pay attention to what you're doing in the moment without judging it. And to me, that's mindfulness, right? That's, if
Yes.
you look at the definition of mindfulness, which, who knows where it even originates, but in Western culture in the United States, the definition that we most often work off of is John Kabat-Zinn's. And it's, we are paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment. And
Mhm.
so maybe people have been doing it, but actually not really knowing that they're doing it. Right. So I don't know. I don't know. And you're right. I think, even in my work today, I think it's still very, maybe the coupling of what I do and the kind of the way I approach mindfulness training is a little bit unique and different. Maybe it's always been there. I don't really know.
Sure.
But I think it's a really profound tool, skill, way of being for humans, but in particular, people who need to perform. And the reality is we all have to perform, right? Whether we're moms, sisters, brothers, people in the corporate world, athletes, right? We're all performing
Right.
at something.
Right.
I think when we take it into the sport world, it can be a really transformational skill.
Mhm. Performance just looks a little different to everybody based on their
Totally.
lifestyle, based on, yeah, what's in front of them. And
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. And it's almost like we finally found another word to put to the practice is mindfulness. It's
Yeah.
awareness, but then, looking at some of the practices that we've been doing for many, many, many years,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's mindfulness.
Yeah.
I think sometimes also, much like mental health, like the stigma around it, like what mindfulness? It's woo woo. I got to meditate. I can't meditate. I don't like to meditate. I rather,
Mhm.
and I think there's this disconnection sometimes. Do you find that in your own journey with integrating mindfulness practices into your work as a therapist or as a coach, how is it received?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's one I get a lot. And like, to be fair, I really haven't had a lot of pushback. Granted, I also over the last 5 years have really changed and transformed my own approach. And I'll give you a great example, right? When I first started kind of and just got my foot in the door at Duke and I started to work with their baseball team, I went in so headstrong and me, I'm such, that kind of quintessential type A, like I want to control everything. I want it to be perfect. I want it to be really good. And my goal was to get all 45 people on their team really bought in. And what I slowly found and developed, and to be fair, I give a lot of credit to my dad as well, because he's been a lot of my sounding board through this work, just given the nature of his skill set as well.
Right.
Um, you know, he very quickly told me, he's like, that's never gonna happen. You need to throw that out the window. Like getting 100% buy-in is just never going to happen. And and maybe I should even clarify and say it's not going to happen in the way that you want it to.
Yeah.
And that really transformed my approach to being, I don't need to create 100% buy-in to get every single one of the athletes on a team to buy into how I do it or how I teach
Mhm.
it. My job is to meet a person, an athlete where they are, right? Um,
Right. Right.
really understand, right, that a team, especially a sport team, is going to be comprised of anywhere from, if you're a golf team, I don't know, maybe 10 to, a football team that's got over 100 plus people on it, right? They're all unique individuals, right? And what one person needs and what resonates with one person may not with the
Mhm.
guy or the gal sitting next to them. And it's not my job really to force anything on anyone, right? How do I, again, meet them where they are
Mhm.
and help them simply open the door to exploration and to curiosity? And curiosity, I think, for me, is such a big part of the work I try to bring, but also in particular mindfulness, right? Because there's this element that we often don't associate with mindfulness, which is this non-judgmental quality. It's like bringing this kind of like beginner's mind, right? Like
Mhm.
this, I don't know. I don't know everything. I'm not going to know everything, and that's okay. And how do I just learn to be a little bit less judgmental, a little bit less critical, and a little bit more curious? And curiosity, I think, is a superpower. You asked me, what do I think my superpower is? I genuinely think that, I mean, I don't know if I have a superpower, but I think it's just being really freaking curious. And I think that's such an advantage for us as humans to very much turn towards ourselves, our thinking, our feeling, our behaving, how we interact with the world around us with curiosity,
Yeah.
as opposed to a very narrow, judgmental, kind of like habitual way, right? It's this curiosity piece is really counterintuitive. So, my point being is like, mindfulness, how is it received? It oftentimes I go in and I don't really know how it's received, right? I'm pretty good at reading a room at this rate. And there will be times where I go into a room and people seem really excited and bought in and curious, and other times I'm like, I don't really know. And it's not really my job to know, right? It's my job
Yeah.
to just slowly keep coming back and keep presenting the information in a couple different ways to eventually one day, maybe it's not even in their 4 years as a college athlete, but maybe it's 10 years later, right, where they
Mhm.
say, holy crap, it's really interesting, right?
That
And like,
hit. Yeah.
that's the impact right there,
Right.
right? So yeah, I think that's a really roundabout way of answering your question.
No, I think that that's great. I mean, because what I also hear too is it's long-term knowledge that it
Yeah,
might not hit them in the moment. I mean, as you and I both know, sometimes you don't know how something feels until it happens, and it
yeah,
sucks that it sometimes has to happen that way for you
yeah.
to gain empathy, for you to look at things in the world a little bit differently. But when you
Mhm.
have that tool set, that toolkit to pull from, you
Yeah,
have those resources to at least put some awareness to it. And it sounds like you do both group and individual therapy. So I can imagine going into a coaching setting with many, many, individuals. Yeah, helping them be more curious because not one thing will always fit one person. Because
yeah,
it worked for you might not work for me and vice versa. But
yeah.
giving them that toolkit, yeah, I think I like that approach and just emphasizing the curiosity.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you hit on, right, is this long-term piece, right? Which is
Mhm.
also really difficult and challenging and counterintuitive because we're such a quick fix society. Like we want answers and we want it figured out now, right? And I do really find that that's not just a generational thing. Like that's an everyone thing. And even as like a therapist and someone that does this every single day for a living, right? Like there are
Right.
still things and places in my life that I'm like, oh my God, why can't I just have it figured out right now? Right. And then the moment that you get there, you kind of say that to yourself and you like, the light bulb goes off and you're like, oh yeah, there we are. Right. Like maybe there's just not an answer right now. Right. And the mindfulness piece, I think it's just super cool. And I love it so much because like there isn't an end game. Like there's no destination. Like you can't be really freaking great at it. You can't master it. It is a skill that for me, I believe I use every single day. I think we as humans can use every single day until the day that we die. Right. And that's like such a cool thing to me. I don't know.
Love
And I really try to, I think most of my athletes will say, like, Emily gets really excited about this stuff. And I want them to see that I get really excited about it, right? Because there's an authenticity there that's like, I'm not going to ask my athletes or give anything to my athletes that I don't do or I haven't done. I genuinely believe that. And I think that, if you get back to that kind of like that buy-in piece and like, how is mindfulness received? Well, I think ultimately what they're receiving is like, at times my relationship with it. Right. And saying, and sometimes that is our door into a concept, right? Maybe I don't believe or trust this thing called mindfulness, but like, man, like Emily seems really excited about it. And, clearly it's done something for her life. So like, okay, maybe I'll give it a try. Right.
Right.
And the discovery, the journey, the curiosity starts there. And like, that's a win too,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I like how you said it's not a destination. So many times we think of these things as a destination. Happiness is not a destination.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving. Our mindfulness and the way that we approach our mental health will constantly evolve.
Yeah. Always.
When it comes to some of the other alternative approaches, what are some of your perspectives maybe on some of the things that are out there that you've seen? Maybe an example of something that you're like, yes, this is awesome, and one where you're like, myth bust it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many, and I think it's a really cool time to be a therapist, to be a performance coach. We were obviously having a conversation about like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which, in the clinical, in therapeutic world is very up and coming. I'm very intrigued by it. I have just actually finished a 6-week, ketamine assisted psychotherapy treatment, which was, incredible. I mean, it was life-changing for me. I think it's life-changing for a lot of people. I think the world of psychedelics in the next decade is going to become, the problem right now is it's not very accessible. And I think so much of our, we really need to think when we're thinking about interventions and a lot of the things that are coming out, even in the performance setting, right? Is like, well, what's actually accessible, right? For the common person.
Oh, yeah.
Because, what the LeBron Jameses can afford is not what, our average college athlete or high school athlete is going to be able to afford. Right. And the same thing with therapeutic interventions, right? I'm very privileged and was able to afford something like ketamine assisted psychotherapy. Most people aren't, right? Super interested in psychedelics. I think and what we know, or I guess what research is starting to find out about what they can do for the brain. So fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I also do quite a bit of, and I think this gets into like the mindfulness realm, right? Like nervous system training. I think the nervous system is really interesting. Polyvagal theory is really fascinating. And I think there are so many elements, like particularly in my performance coaching, right? I mean, yes, in a therapeutic in a therapeutic setting, like they can be very profound, and especially working with trauma, but also in a performance setting, right? Because at the end of the day, the nervous system is going to be the foundation of the mind and body, right? This connection between the mind and the body. And that is absolutely critical for performance for an athlete. So if we give them more tools, more agency, more control over that, then man, I mean, that's a really powerful thing. Also just in terms of like the recovery aspect as well. Huge.
Sure. Yeah. So it's not just ice baths and
no. And I think the ice bath thing is, the cold immersion that's another one that like I'm intrigued by. I'll say that. I think more research, like simply put, more research has to be done. And I think what people don't always consider with the cold immersion stuff is like, anytime that we are working with the nervous system and taxing, like what people don't understand is like that even though it's a good tax on the body, the nervous system, the mind, it's still tax, right? Mm-hmm. So like I have literally experienced someone go into shock after going into a cold tub, like actual shock, had to call an ambulance, right? Because what we didn't understand, and this is why I'm such a big piece, because at the end of the day, right, we are the experts of ourselves. I can never be the expert of anybody else, any of my athletes, any of my clients. But if we give our athletes in particular the tools to be their own experts, then
Mm-hmm.
that athlete could have actually been in a position to know that, hey, you know what, my mind, my body, my nervous system, really, it's not a good idea for me to get in the cold tub right now and go into cold shock immersion, right? And so that's where I'm like, before we start layering on all of this fancy, stuff, and, who knows if like, some people would say, well, getting in an ice tub is not really that fancy. But what I'm saying is it's a layer that comes after helping someone get to know themselves,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
helping them get to know their nervous system at a really foundational level. And that's really where the power lies, in my opinion.
That is such an important thing. I think you mentioned too, is getting them to know themselves to be the expert. Because
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, like when you put your body into shock of any kind,
Yeah.
you can't just be like, oh, try this, you're going to feel better. And then somebody like the circumstance that one of your athletes had gone through.
Yeah.
And a little bit, I'm happy to hear your answer on that, because I am not somebody that's going to get into a hot or into an ice bath. I've tried it. Okay, cool. I feel like it's everywhere on my news feed. Friends are like, I just bought this $7,000 tub to put ice in. And I'm like, I started reading some of the studies, and the studies that I'm seeing, it's like, yes, you get this jolt, this kind of this energy to your system.
Mm-hmm.
However, when it compares to other things that jolt someone's energy and get them excited or feel brisk, it's not better or worse than,
Right.
maybe going out for a brisk walk or so, it's interesting. I think, by all means, if that's something that works for somebody and they feel that they're getting benefits from them mentally and physically, more to them. Again, it's a resource, it's a tool.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting how sometimes these things can just blow up in society and become the like, well, if you're not doing it, then you're not even
another like one kind of similar to that is like Wim Hof breathing, right? Like, which it's like, again, it's like, fine, I have several athletes that love it, that do it really religiously, but like the thing is you are manipulating your nervous system, you're manipulating your mind and your body. And before you ever do that, and this is why, again, breath work, ice baths doesn't matter. Like, if we help you get to know you, mind, body, nervous system, and at any given moment you have the power to tap into, where am I, right? Like in my nervous system. And a lot of this has to do with interoception, right? Like this sensation, the feeling in my body, which many people are really disconnected from, right? This knowing yourself starts there. And then you're able to actually step into practices that either you're interested in or might benefit you and say, okay, that really helped me, or okay, that didn't help me at all, right? That's the power, right? I don't care what it is, right? Again, some people really resonate with ice baths and Wim Hof breathing, and some people really don't. But in order for you to ever be able to even get to that place of knowing if it helps or not, you have to know yourself. That is my whole theory. And I think it's really important. At the end of the day, it's also a safety thing, in my opinion.
And that what brings me to my next question too, is, we think about knowing thyself, but also, what about your vitals in some of these cases? Because I would think like, from what I read about ketamine, like there's a whole process of understanding what are your levels and going through blood tests in some circumstances. But to the point of safety is, you're going to plunge into something of, negative 30 degrees or whatever temperature they're at. That's probably way too cold, but you know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying, yeah.
Know thyself and know the chemical makeup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and again, like for whatever it is, right? I think the standards are going to be different. So let's take psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which is like, there is a heck of a lot that people are going through, at least in my experience, right? Before you ever get to the point where you're actually going through the dosing, right? It's not, you can't just sign up for psychedelic assisted treatment. There's screening processes, and depending on what psychedelic you're using, I should preface, like ketamine is not a true psychedelic. It's a dissociative anesthetic. So, but there's screening processes, there's vetting, there's a lot that goes into this prior to you ever getting or receiving any psychedelic, right? And to be fair, I think there is a lot happening in our world, and I think social media feeds a lot of this, where it's like, oh, well, I saw this person do it, so you know what? I'm just going to go do it too, right? And the reality is that I think I saw something somewhere that was like social media can never be a prescription, right? It can never, and it never should be, right? Because one, social media is not reality, and two, like every person is a unique human being, right? And so what you need is not necessarily what's being put out on social media. So yeah, I mean, we could, gosh, I feel like you and I could talk for hours on this stuff and the
nerd out.
yeah, social media. But like, I think in the mental health space and especially when we're talking about the nervous system and physiology, and trust me, there's a lot out there. People are really hopping on the nervous system thing, the somatic experiencing.
Yeah.
And again, I really just want to preface that, like, what is being put on therapy, or excuse me, what is being put on social media, even by licensed clinicians and therapists, is not necessarily for you. And you should never be using that information to then prescribe or take action for yourself without speaking to your own medical provider who is going to know you. And I love when my clients, right, or my athletes go, hey, I saw this on social media. Take a look at it. What do you think? Right? Because sometimes they bring it and it's like, wow, I really like that. What do you think about that? Right? And sometimes it's like, oh, no. Like that's going down the rabbit hole. Like, right. That has nothing to do with, right. And it's either misinformation, it's disinformation, right? So using social media as a tool again, and if we get back to this whole thing that we started with, right, which is like curiosity, like use it as a place to just maybe spark some curiosity and exploration, but really nothing more, in my opinion.
And well, no, it's a good reminder. And I mean, I'm guilty of it too. And it's the interesting time too, because I think we're starting to see the stigma be lowered around mental health. And you're seeing a lot of therapists, really solid content creators, including yourself, sharing these stories. And what is the term that I had learned about? Pop psychology or pop therapy or something like that, where, we're starting to actually understand terms. However, it's, also understanding you can't just take social media and then apply it. If you're listening to a therapist and you're learning something, then maybe it's time to take that into your therapy session and talk more about it.
Totally.
Because I see so many people now, they throw around the word narcissist, they throw around the word bipolar, and it's, especially with people that, growing up with people that were clinically by nature, it's an interesting time. So, I think that's a great reminder. And one of the other things that I want to touch on is accessibility, because I too I just find it fascinating, all the work that's going into psychedelics and psilocybin and ketamine. And I've listened to Huberman's podcast. It was like 3 hours long.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The use of psilocybin. And, I think one of the things that comes down to it is when I looked at ketamine, it's like $1,300 a session. And you had, in some instances, it being covered by insurance for, especially some of our veterans who needed access to this. This was the one thing that really helped them find hope in anything. And I think it's not just the price. I think what I also worry about is, God rest his soul, poor Matthew Perry, who had died because of some complications with it. And you hear people that take mushrooms and they run around town and do something, crazy. And, some of the worry that I have is accessibility outside of a controlled experience. And everyone's like, oh yeah, mushrooms are great for you, I'm going to replace that with my anti whatever, your antidepressants. And they self-medicate, but then don't understand the whole therapeutic aspect is you need to go sit your butt on a couch, put a screen, a mask on, and listen to music if you want to do some of these things. Like there's a therapeutic journey that can help you on this, but if you take it incorrectly, it can be detrimental.
Yeah, 100%. So a couple of things. From everything that I have looked at with Matthew Perry, and I think it's really important to know because there's a lot of misinformation around that, right? Yes, he had ketamine in his system from what I have read, and what's really important to know about ketamine compared to other psychedelics is the half-life is much shorter. The half-life of ketamine is like 3 to 4 days. The even trip of ketamine is going to be shorter. So like, for example, like when and again, all of this is depending on dosage, but like my ketamine experience, right? When I'm going in for a dosing session, once I take the ketamine and it's ingested, the trip, you're only in the trip for about 30 minutes, if that.
Oh, wow.
Some of my trips were even shorter than that, right? Other psychedelics, that's not the case. They're much longer. And so I think it's really important, especially because ketamine assisted psychotherapy is becoming more popular, and I think there's been some tainting of it since Matthew Perry's death, which is so tragic. But the ketamine, his last dosing session within his psychotherapeutic treatment, right, was a week and a half prior to his death, which means that the ketamine in his system could not have been the ketamine taken during his treatment. So yes, what that gets back to is that when we're taking and quite frankly abusing, right, drugs, psychedelics outside of where they're intended to be used for therapeutic treatment, yes, they can have very detrimental consequences. And there is a reason. So ketamine, I think, is the only actual FDA approved psychedelic treatment at this point, right? But there's a reason that there are a lot of protocols. There's a lot of trainings around this for people who are going to give them. That all of this is overseen by medical doctors. And it's a very, I mean, my experience in general was very structured, right? There is and it is not like you're just going in and you're taking ketamine and you're going on a trip. Like there is a lot of psychotherapy that goes along with this. So essentially, especially with ketamine, in my experience, right, it's you have a dosing session, and then within 4 days, due to the impact of neuroplasticity in the brain that ketamine has, you're doing therapy, right? It's one of the hardest, most challenging experiences I've ever been through. It's a lot. And you get back to that accessibility piece, like, I'm not working on the days that I'm going in for a dosing session because I'm going in for a dosing session at 9 a.m. I'm not feeling like a normal real person until about 4 or 5 that day. So there's no way that I can work. You can't drive yourself. You can't drive yourself home. You're Ubering, right? Like there's a lot of pieces around psychedelic assisted treatment that are just not accessible right now. And I really, really hope that that changes. And there's a couple people around the country that are really trying to change that. And I really, someday I hope to get involved with that because I think it's really, really important. But this even gets back to the social media thing, which like I've heard many therapists, many organizations say that like, oh, well, one of the ways we make mental health more accessible is by putting more information and more things out on social media, right? I'm like, well, yes and no, right? Like, again, there's a reason, in my opinion, right, that, well, let me back up. Not everyone needs to be in therapy, right? Could everyone go to therapy? 100%. Therapy's great, right? Therapy's awesome. You know me, I'm a therapist. But the reality is like not every human needs to be in therapy. And so, yes, there are layers. And this is kind of where we get into, if we look at kind of like divisions of like how we might attack mental health work, right? Like the micro level being one-on-one, what we think of as like a person going to therapy. There's also the meso level, which is like, okay, smaller groups, but there's also the macro level, right? Things we can be doing, large scale society. And unfortunately, like our healthcare system just really doesn't help, right? So it's, I don't have an answer. I don't know the answer. But what I will say is like, I think a lot of my coaching business, right, and the performance aspect I take, which is like pretty holistic. Like, I'll be honest, like sometimes I even struggle to call myself a performance coach because like, sure, performance is really important, but like, I'm not sure I really spend a whole lot of my time focusing on the performance element, right? I'm really focusing on the person because if we don't get the person just operating well in all facets of their life, they're going to have a really hard time performing.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways within my own coaching business, right, that I am proactively addressing mental health at a more meso or macro level. And I think we need to get more creative there. And I think organizations, whether it's businesses, corporations, right, or it's athletic departments or athletic teams, like we need to be doing a better job there. I think we're headed in the right direction, but we have a really long ways to go.
Yeah.
And, like all things, especially with the psychedelic piece, I mean, I even think there's a lot of like somatic therapy that's not very accessible, right? Somatic intervention, which is also kind of new and up and coming, which is a much more body-based experience to therapy. It's less of that. There is a talking element, but there's less of that.
Yeah.
A lot of insurance companies don't cover that, right? So it's, it's a catch-22.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many things out there. I think this just goes back to helping people discover more about themselves and feel more confident as experts of their own lives to make these choices. I mean, the information is great, but yeah, social media can only be a jumping off point, a point of I've learned this information. Now, what will I do to better inform myself?
Yeah, totally. Love
so
that.
I think even in Huberman's podcast, he's like, if we keep abusing these things that are helping people, then we're going to mess it up for them and to continue to research so that people can continue to be helped. So
totally. Yeah, no, you're spot on.
So Emily, where can people get in touch with you? Where can people find you?
That's a great question. So I am active on most social media channels. Instagram, Emily Perrin LMSW. I had to think about that for a second. I'm also on Twitter, Emily L. Perrin. I have a YouTube channel, which is just Google Emily Perrin, which has a bunch of my, meditations and yoga practices and stuff like that.
Great. Yeah.
And then, my website, which is perrinwellnessperformance.com.
Perfect. I'm going to add some of these in there. And because we're both on YouTube, I think I can share this so we can collaborate on the same episode.
Perfect.
But I'll link in some of those yoga and meditations as well.
Amazing. Sounds fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
Good to see you. It's so good to see you. And I know I'll be seeing you soon. Happy New Year.
You too.